What happens when the biggest song of your career becomes the one song you almost gave up on completely? For Rush, that story begins with Tom Sawyer. Today, the track is considered one of the greatest rock songs ever recorded. It's the song that introduced millions of fans to Rush, the song that turned Neil Peart into a drumming icon, the song that still explodes through arenas, radio stations, sports broadcasts, and movie soundtracks more than 40 years later. But according to Geddy, there was a time when nobody in the band was even sure the song belonged on moving pictures at all. In fact, Lee recently admitted that during the recording process, Tom Sawyer felt like the weakest song on the album. That sounds unbelievable now, considering Moving Pictures became Rush's biggest commercial success and one of the most respected rock albums ever made. But behind the scenes, the song nearly drove the band insane. The arrangement wasn't working, the mix sounded wrong. Alex Lifeson's guitar tone felt lifeless. Even the studio equipment kept malfunctioning during recording sessions. And for a band already known for perfectionism, every problem only created more pressure. By 1980, Rush were already evolving into something completely different from the hard rock power trio fans first discovered in the 70s. Albums like Permanent Waves showed the band leaning heavily into synthesizers, tighter songwriting, and more modern production. But when work began on Moving Pictures, the pressure was enormous. Rush knew this album had to push them forward creatively without losing the technical complexity that made them unique. That's where Tom Sawyer entered the picture. The song started as a lyrical idea inspired by poet Pi Dubois, who provided a rough concept about a modern rebellious individualist. Neil Peart then reshaped the lyrics into something deeper and more philosophical. Instead of Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer character, Rush created a modern version, an independent thinker resisting conformity and public expectations. Musically, though, the band struggled to make the idea work. Geddy later admitted the song simply refused to come together naturally in the studio. For weeks, the band reportedly viewed it as the weak point of the album. That's shocking considering today it's often ranked as Rush's defining masterpiece. But at the time, frustration was taking over the sessions. One of the biggest problems centered around Alex Lifeson's guitar sound. Rush wanted Tom Sawyer to feel massive, futuristic, and aggressive all at once. But according to Lifeson, the guitar tones kept sounding flat during playback. Nothing had the energy the band imagined in their heads. That's when engineer Paul Northfield stepped in. Northfield began experimenting with microphone positioning, stereo spread techniques, and room ambience effects. Suddenly, the song started transforming. The guitar finally sounded wide and cinematic instead of thin and buried in the mix. That change became one of the turning points in the entire recording process. But the technical problems still weren't over. During the mixing sessions, the studio's automated console system reportedly started malfunctioning. Instead of trusting the automation, the members of Rush ended up manually controlling sections of the mix themselves. Imagine trying to create one of the most complicated rock songs of the era while physically handling parts of the mix in real time because the equipment kept failing. At that stage, Geddy still wasn't convinced Tom Sawyer was good enough. The band had spent so much time fighting with the song that exhaustion was starting to replace excitement. Then came the moment everything changed. When the final mix finally blasted through the studio speakers, the entire atmosphere shifted instantly. The huge synth opening, Neil Peart's explosive drums, Lifeson's atmospheric guitar textures, and Geddy Lee's aggressive bass pedals suddenly locked together perfectly. Lee later remembered the reaction clearly. Holy fuck, okay, this works. That was the breakthrough. The very song Rush feared might drag down Moving Pictures suddenly sounded enormous, powerful, different, dangerous, and most importantly, unmistakably Rush. Released in 1981, Tom Sawyer immediately exploded. The song became a massive hit on rock radio and helped push Moving Pictures into legendary territory. Tracks like YYZ, Limelight, and Red Barchetta also became fan favorites, but Tom Sawyer stood above everything else commercially. For many casual listeners, Tom Sawyer became Rush. And while fans embraced the song instantly, the band members eventually developed a much more complicated relationship with it, especially Geddy Lee. Over the decades, Tom Sawyer became unavoidable. It played constantly on classic rock stations. Sports arenas blasted it before games. Movies and television shows used it repeatedly. Video games introduced younger generations to it. Neil Peart's drum fills became some of the most analyzed and celebrated performances in rock history. For fans, the song never got old. But for Geddy Lee, hearing the same song thousands upon thousands of times eventually became exhausting. In later interviews, Lee admitted he grew sick of hearing it everywhere, and honestly, that feeling probably makes sense. Imagine creating hundreds of songs across a 40-year career, only for one track to permanently overshadow everything else. That's the strange reality many legendary bands face. A signature song can become both a blessing and a burden at the same time. It gives a band immortality, but it can also trap them creatively inside one moment forever. For Rush, Tom Sawyer became that permanent shadow. No matter how experimental or ambitious their later albums became, the world always came back to that one song. And still, Rush continued playing it live because they understood what it meant to fans. Part of what made Tom Sawyer so powerful was Neil Peart's drumming. His performance on the track became one of the defining moments of his career. The precision, power, and complexity completely changed how many rock fans viewed drummers in mainstream music. Even today, aspiring drummers still study every section of that performance. Peart approached drumming almost like architecture. Every fill had structure. Every cymbal accent served a purpose. And on Tom Sawyer, his playing balanced technical brilliance with raw energy perfectly. That balance helped the song cross over from progressive rock into mainstream culture. Geddy Lee's bass work also played a huge role. The aggressive bass pedals underneath the synth layers gave the track an intensity most rock bands simply couldn't replicate. Combined with Lifeson's textured guitar work, Rush created something futuristic without losing heaviness. That's why the song aged so well. Even younger listeners discovering Rush decades later still recognize how unique Tom Sawyer sounds compared to most rock music from the early 80s. It wasn't just technically impressive, it felt alive. And ironically, all of that nearly never happened because the band almost lost faith in the song during production. The emotional weight surrounding Tom Sawyer became even heavier after Neil Peart's death in 2020. Today, every conversation about the song carries an entirely different feeling for Rush fans. What was once simply a legendary rock anthem now also represents the memory of one of music's most respected drummers. That emotional connection is part of why Geddy Lee's recent comments resonated so deeply online. Fans weren't just shocked that Rush struggled with the song creatively, they were fascinated by how close the band came to doubting one of rock history's defining tracks. It reminds people that even legendary musicians experience insecurity, frustration, and burnout while creating timeless music. Sometimes masterpieces don't arrive smoothly. Sometimes they emerge through exhaustion, arguments, technical disasters, and moments where artists genuinely believe something isn't working. Tom Sawyer became proof of that reality. And maybe that struggle is exactly why the song still feels powerful today. You can almost hear the tension inside the recording itself, the urgency, the aggression, the determination to force something difficult into existence. Rush didn't accidentally create Tom Sawyer. They fought for it. In the end, Geddy Lee's confession changes the way many fans will hear Tom Sawyer forever. What sounded like effortless greatness was actually one of the hardest songs Rush ever made. The band battled technical failures, creative frustration, endless mixing problems, and moments of serious doubt before finally realizing they had created something special. And then came the strange twist nobody could have predicted. The song they nearly abandoned became the song that defined their entire legacy. That legacy only grew larger with time. Moving Pictures became one of the greatest rock albums ever released. Tom Sawyer became Rush's signature anthem. Neil Peart's drumming became legendary. And generations of musicians continue studying the song more than 4 decades later. Yet behind all that success remains a deeply human story about creativity and pressure. Even the greatest bands in history sometimes struggle to recognize their own masterpieces while they're creating them. For Rush, Tom Sawyer was difficult to make, impossible to escape, and ultimately too powerful to deny. And maybe that's the reason the song still matters today. Not because it was perfect from the beginning, but because three musicians refused to quit on it when everything seemed to be falling apart.